I met Isabel when we were just teenagers, back when life felt simple and love seemed like the answer to every question. She was the girl everyone noticed, the kind of beauty that stopped conversations and turned heads. But what drew me to her wasn't just her looks. It was her laugh, the way she could light up a room with a single smile. By the time I enlisted in the Army at 19, Isabel and I had been inseparable for 3 years. We got married on a cool September morning, just days before I shipped off to boot camp. The military wasn't just a job for me. It was an escape. Growing up in a rundown neighborhood, I knew there were few options for someone like me. The Army promised structure, purpose, and the chance to build a life Isabel and I could be proud of. She supported me too, saying all the right things. How proud she was, how she couldn't wait to travel the world with me, and how she'd always be by my side. I believed her. Hell, I believed in us. Our first few months as newlyweds were spent in letters and short phone calls. I was knee-deep in training, learning to navigate the grueling demands of the Army. Isabel stayed behind in our small rented apartment, working part-time and preparing for what we hoped would be our bright future. By the time I completed Ranger School and earned my first promotion, we were ready to reunite. My orders came through, a year-long assignment overseas, stationed on a sprawling base with families allowed. We arrived in Germany together, bright-eyed and hopeful. The base was bustling with activity, a constant hum of soldiers, civilians, and their families. Isabel quickly made friends with other military spouses, forming a tight-knit group that spent their days exploring the town, shopping, and attending socials while we soldiers pulled grueling shifts. I worked security details, long 24-hour rotations followed by 18 hours off, sometimes less if admin duties piled up. The Army didn't make room for downtime, but I didn't complain. This was the life I'd signed up for. But cracks began to show within months. Isabel grew restless. At first, it was small comments, a sigh when I left for another shift, an offhand remark about how lonely she felt on base. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just an adjustment period. But soon, she started staying out later with her friends, coming home with stories of nights at the officers' club or weekend trips to nearby cities. I trusted her, or at least I wanted to. Isabel had always been social. It was one of the things I loved about her. Still, something about the way her laughter seemed forced when she talked about her nights out made me uneasy. The first real warning sign came 6 months into our assignment. Isabel had enrolled in a few college courses on base, hoping to make use of her downtime. One of her professors, a captain named Ryan Carter, quickly became a household name. Every conversation seemed to circle back to him. "Captain Carter is so smart," she'd say. Or, "You'd love his sense of humor. He's hilarious." At first, I didn't think much of it. Ryan was an officer, far above my rank, and Isabel's glowing praise seemed innocent enough. But then she started calling him Ryan instead of Captain Carter, and my gut began to churn. One evening, I surprised her by stopping by her class after my shift. Peeking through the small window in the door, I saw the way she looked at him. Her smile was radiant, her eyes locked on his, as though no one else in the room existed. My heart sank. When I confronted her later that night, she dismissed my concerns with a laugh. "You're being paranoid," she said, brushing past me. "Ryan is just a friend. You're working too hard. You're seeing things that aren't there." Her words stung, but I told myself she was right. I was exhausted, overworked, and running on fumes. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe I just needed to trust her. By the time my first year overseas was nearing its end, Isabel's restlessness had grown into something else, something sharper. She complained more often about everything from the base housing to my long hours. "This isn't the life I signed up for," she said one night, tears in her eyes. "You're never here, and when you are, you're too tired to care." I wanted to argue, to remind her that I was doing this for us, but the words died in my throat. I had no answers, only excuses. The Army demanded everything from me, and there was little left to give. Then she dropped the bombshell. "I think we should separate." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I need time," she said. "Time to figure out what I want. Time to figure out if this is what I want." I didn't know what to say. We'd been married less than 2 years, and already the cracks were threatening to break us apart. But I loved her. I couldn't imagine a life without her. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. The legal separation was filed, and Isabel returned to the States while I finished my assignment. I told myself it was temporary, that we'd find our way back to each other. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't until months later, after I returned home, that I learned the truth about Isabel's time overseas, and the man she'd been spending it with. Returning stateside after a grueling overseas assignment felt like stepping into a different world. My year in Germany had been a blur of long shifts, endless responsibilities, and the growing shadow of my strained marriage. But now, as I stepped off the plane and into the humid air of home, I was filled with cautious hope. Isabel was waiting for me at the terminal, her smile bright and her arms outstretched. For a moment, it felt like everything might go back to the way it was. We had a fresh start ahead of us, a new duty station with 8-hour shifts, more time together, and the chance to rebuild what we'd lost. Isabel seemed excited, talking nonstop on the drive home about setting up the new house, trying new restaurants, and exploring the city. I wanted to believe her, to hold on to the idea that the worst was behind us. For a while, things seemed to improve. We went on date nights, shared quiet dinners, and even made plans for the future. But underneath the surface, something still felt off. Isabel's enthusiasm had a manufactured quality, like she was trying too hard to convince me, and maybe herself, that everything was fine. The first major crack came one afternoon when I came home earlier than expected. The house was quiet, except for the faint sound of the phone ringing upstairs. I made my way to the kitchen, where the other phone was sitting on the counter. Picking it up, I heard Isabel's voice on the line. "Hello, Ryan," she said, her tone warm and familiar. My blood ran cold. I covered the receiver instinctively, heart pounding as I listened to their conversation. It was clear they'd been talking for a while. There was no awkward small talk, only the ease of two people deeply familiar with one another. "I miss you," she said softly. "It's been too long." Ryan's voice crackled on the other end, low and intimate. "I miss you too. I've been thinking about you nonstop." My stomach churned. I wanted to hang up, to stop listening, but I couldn't. Her words kept coming, each one a dagger to my chest. She laughed softly at something he said, then lowered her voice. "When can we see each other again?" My grip tightened on the phone, the plastic creaking under the pressure. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the receiver down, my hands shaking as I tried to process what I'd just heard. The doubts that had been gnawing at me for months were no longer doubts. They were reality. I stormed upstairs, where Isabel was sitting on the bed with her phone in hand. Her face paled when she saw me, and I didn't waste any time. "How long?" I demanded, my voice low and trembling with barely restrained fury. She tried to play dumb at first. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I snapped. "How long have you been sleeping with him?" Her face crumpled, and she burst into tears. "It was a mistake," she sobbed. "It didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You've been sneaking around with him behind my back, probably for months, and you're telling me it didn't mean anything?" She broke down completely, her words tumbling out in fragmented confessions. Yes, she had slept with Ryan. It started when we were stationed in Germany. He pursued her, made her feel special, and given her the attention she felt I couldn't. "You were never around," she said, her voice trembling. "You were always working, always exhausted. I was lonely, Paul. I needed someone." Her words hit me like a slap to the face. I wanted to argue, to tell her that I'd been killing myself for our future. But what was the point? She'd made her choice, and it wasn't me. I asked the questions I knew would haunt me later. Was he better in bed? Did he make her feel something I couldn't? She shook her head, her answers a cold comfort. "It wasn't about that," she said. "He made me feel like a princess. You were just never there." Her reasoning felt like a twisted justification for betrayal. I couldn't believe the woman I had fought so hard to build a life with could look me in the eye and say these things. The days that followed were a haze of anger, sadness, and disbelief. I didn't know how to move forward, or if I even wanted to. Isabel insisted she wanted to make things work, that she still loved me, but her actions said otherwise. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was the betrayal. Our once loving home became a battlefield. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was filled with resentment and blame. Isabel claimed she'd ended things with Ryan, but I didn't believe her. How could I? The trust between us was shattered, replaced by a constant knot in my stomach every time she left the house or answered her phone. Then came the straw that broke the camel's back. A week after our confrontation, I discovered a receipt tucked into her purse for a motel just outside the city. The date matched the weekend I'd been on a field training exercise. My heart sank as I stared at the slip of paper, knowing exactly what it meant. That night, I confronted her again, laying the receipt on the table in front of her. "Explain this." Her face crumpled as she realized there was no way out this time. She confessed that she'd seen Ryan again, that she'd been too weak to resist. "But it's over now," she insisted, tears streaming down her face. "I swear, Paul, I want to be with you." But I was done with her promises, done with her lies. As the walls of our marriage continued to crumble, I made a decision. I needed to focus on what mattered: my career, my future, and my sanity. Isabel had made her choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. The days following Isabel's second confession were some of the darkest I'd ever experienced. The woman I had promised forever to was a stranger, a liar who had chosen deceit over loyalty. Every time I walked into our house, it felt smaller, suffocating, as though the weight of her betrayal was seeping into the walls. And yet I stayed, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't figure out what to do next. Isabel, for her part, acted like nothing had changed. She went about her days with the same cheerfulness that had once made me fall in love with her. But now, every laugh, every smile felt like a knife in my side. At night, she'd reach for me, her touch soft, pleading, as if she could erase everything with a kiss. But I couldn't bring myself to pretend anymore. I turned away from her in bed, the gap between us growing wider with each passing day. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Isabel asked if we could talk. I reluctantly agreed, sitting across from her at the kitchen table as she wrung her hands nervously. "Paul," she began, her voice trembling, "I know I've hurt you, and I know it'll take time to rebuild the trust I've broken. But I want to make things right. I love you, and I want us to work." Her words might have sounded genuine, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt in my chest. "You say that," I replied, my tone cold, "but your actions tell a different story. You've lied to me over and over, Isabel. Why should I believe this time is any different?" Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the motel receipt, the whispered phone calls, and the countless other signs I'd ignored. Her tears no longer moved me the way they once had. "I don't know how to prove it to you," she said softly. I don't want to lose you." "You already have," I said, standing up from the table. "You just don't realize it yet." The next morning, as Isabel left for a supposed brunch with her girlfriends, I decided to follow her. I wasn't proud of it, but my gut told me there was more to the story. I'd spent months giving her the benefit of the doubt, and it had brought me nothing but heartbreak. This time, I needed proof. I trailed her car at a safe distance, my hands gripping the wheel as I watched her drive toward the edge of town. My heart pounded as she pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe. She stepped out of the car, glancing around nervously before heading inside. A few minutes later, another car pulled up, a sleek, black sedan I didn't recognize. My stomach sank as a man stepped out, his tailored jacket and confident stride unmistakable. It was Ryan. They greeted each other with an embrace that lasted far too long for old friends. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to storm inside and confront them. Instead, I pulled out my phone, snapping a few pictures through the windshield. The evidence was grainy, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew. Isabel's promises were as empty as her vows. For the next hour, I watched as they laughed over coffee, their body language intimate and familiar. When they finally left, I followed at a distance, my pulse racing. To my surprise, they didn't head for a motel or his place. Instead, they drove to an upscale neighborhood and entered a house with a perfectly manicured lawn and a red door. It hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a fling. Ryan had integrated Isabel into his life, into his home. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, replaying the scene in my mind. How long had this been going on? How many lies had she told to keep this secret? The answers didn't matter. All that mattered was what I would do next. That night, I began gathering everything I could. Every text, every photo, every piece of evidence that painted a picture of Isabel's betrayal. I knew I needed to be smart. A confrontation would only escalate the situation, and I couldn't risk losing my career. Or worse, being trapped in a marriage that was slowly destroying me. I reached out to a lawyer the next day, laying out everything I had discovered. He listened patiently, his expression grim as I recounted the events of the past year. "You've got a solid case for divorce," he said finally. "But be prepared, it won't be easy. These things rarely are." I nodded, my resolve hardening. "I just want out," I said, "and I want to make sure she can't take everything from me." For the next few weeks, I played the part of the dutiful husband, keeping my plans close to my chest. Isabel continued her charade, acting as though our marriage was on the mend, while I worked quietly behind the scenes. I adjusted our finances, closed joint accounts, and redirected my paycheck into a new account she couldn't access. Slowly but surely, I was building an escape plan. But just when I thought I had everything under control, Isabel threw me another curveball. One evening, as we were sitting in the living room, Isabel turned to me, her expression hesitant. "Paul," she said, "I need to tell you something." I braced myself, half expecting another round of excuses or half-truths. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. "I'm pregnant," she said softly. The room spun. My mind raced as I tried to process her words. I had been distant for months, avoiding her touch, shutting her out emotionally and physically. The timing didn't add up. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know how this looks, Paul, but I swear it's yours." Her words were desperate, but they rang hollow. I didn't believe her. How could I? Everything she'd said and done up to this point had been a lie. And now this? As the reality of her revelation sank in, I realized I was at a crossroads. I could stay and fight for a relationship that was already broken beyond repair, or I could finally let go and take control of my life. I chose the latter. The night Isabel told me she was pregnant, my entire world tilted. Her words felt like a blow I didn't see coming, and for a moment I couldn't even respond. My mind raced, trying to reconcile what she was saying with the reality I knew. The timing didn't add up, not even close. We hadn't been together like that in months, not in any meaningful way. She sat there, crying, swearing the child was mine. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't say much that night. I didn't yell or argue. I just sat in stunned silence, letting her words wash over me like a wave I couldn't stop. When I finally found my voice, I told her I wanted a paternity test. That was the only thing I said before I left the room. Over the next few days, the house felt heavier than ever. Isabel avoided me as much as possible, retreating to the bedroom or staying out late. When she was home, her presence was a minefield. One wrong move, and everything could explode. I went through the motions, focusing on work and keeping my head down, but the doubt gnawed at me constantly. I could feel it in my gut. This wasn't my child. One night, I heard her on the phone in the bathroom. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but the walls in the house are thin. I couldn't hear every word, but I didn't need to. I caught enough snippets of her apologies, her pleading, and of course his name, Ryan. My fists clenched at the sound of it, and for a brief moment, I thought about confronting her right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and wondering how much more I could take. The next day, while she was out, I searched her things. I didn't feel guilty about it. Not anymore. Trust was long gone, and I needed answers. It didn't take me long to find a receipt from a prenatal clinic. My heart sank when I read it. It wasn't Isabel's name on the document. It was Ryan's. I stared at that piece of paper for what felt like forever, my mind spinning. This wasn't just another lie or some emotional affair. She had dragged me into her mess, into her lies, and now into her pregnancy. My hands shook as I folded the receipt and tucked it into my pocket. There was no denying the truth anymore. That evening, I put the receipt on the table in front of her without a word. Her face went pale the second she saw it. She knew there was no talking her way out of this one. For a moment, she just sat there, frozen, before the tears started. She tried to explain, to tell me it wasn't what I thought, but I didn't need to hear it. The paper said it all. She had lied to me again, and this time, she couldn't even bother to cover her tracks. I walked out of the room as she cried, her voice following me down the hall. It didn't matter anymore. Her words meant nothing to me. All I could feel was anger. Anger at her, at Ryan, and at myself for letting it go on this long. The next day, I went to my lawyer with a receipt and laid everything out. He listened carefully, taking notes as I explained the situation. When I finished, he sat back and gave me a grim look. "If the child isn't yours, this will strengthen your case for divorce," he said. "But proving it will take time, especially if she refuses a paternity test. In the meantime, you need to protect yourself." And that's exactly what I did. Over the next few weeks, I closed our joint accounts, redirected my paycheck to a private account, and started separating my life from hers. I didn't tell Isabel what I was doing. I didn't see the point. She was still pretending everything could go back to normal, as if her lies weren't hanging over us like a storm cloud. Then Ryan showed up. I came home from work one afternoon to find his car in my driveway. My heart pounded as I pulled up, seeing them standing on the porch. Isabel looked nervous, her arms crossed tightly, while Ryan gestured calmly like he had every right to be there. I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and trying to keep my composure. But the sight of him, smug and self-assured, made my blood boil. I got out of the car, my footsteps heavy as I approached. They noticed me then. Ryan straightened up, his face unreadable, while Isabel froze. They didn't say anything as I walked past them and into the house. I locked the door behind me, shutting them both out. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of relief. I didn't care what they had to say. I didn't need to hear their excuses or their explanations. I had everything I needed to move forward. Isabel pounded on the door, begging me to let her in, but I didn't even flinch. I sat on the couch, staring at the walls of the house we had once shared, and realized it was time to let go. The life I thought I had was gone, replaced by something darker, uglier. But I wasn't going to let it define me. That night, as the house grew quiet again, I made a promise to myself. I would rebuild. I didn't know how yet, but I knew one thing for certain. This was the beginning of the end for Isabel and me. The night Isabel told me she was pregnant, I felt the ground fall out from under me. The timing didn't add up. Our physical relationship had been nearly non-existent for months. Her tears and assurances that the baby was mine didn't move me. My instincts screamed the truth, and I told her flatly that I wanted a paternity test. She cried harder, accusing me of not trusting her. I didn't respond. Trust was long gone. Over the next few days, the tension was suffocating. Isabel avoided me, retreating to the bedroom or spending hours out of the house. Late one night, I overheard her whispering on the phone in the bathroom. Her voice was soft, apologetic, and I caught Ryan's name. My blood boiled. Even now, with everything crumbling around us, she was still tied to him. The next day, while she was out, I searched her purse. I didn't feel guilty anymore. I needed answers. I found a receipt from a prenatal clinic, dated 2 weeks earlier. But what truly shattered me was the name on it. It wasn't hers, it was Ryan's. That night, I put the receipt on the table in front of her. Her face went pale, and she stammered for an explanation, but I didn't care. The betrayal was complete, and her excuses were meaningless. I walked out of the room, her sobs trailing behind me, but I was done listening. The following day, I met with my lawyer and began separating myself from her. I redirected my paycheck, closed our joint accounts, and prepared for the inevitable divorce. Isabel, unaware of my plans, continued her charade, acting as though everything could somehow go back to normal. Then Ryan showed up. I came home to find his car in the driveway and them standing on the porch. Isabel looked tense. Ryan exuded arrogance. I walked past them without a word, locking the door behind me. Let them stew on the porch. For the first time in months, I felt clarity. The life I had with Isabel was dead, and it was time to focus on building a new one. That night, I promised myself this would end. No more lies, no more waiting. Isabel's betrayal had burned everything to ash, but I wasn't going to let her take my future with her. The days after Ryan's visit solidified what I already knew. There was no saving my marriage. Whatever Isabel and I had built together had long since crumbled, leaving nothing but resentment, betrayal, and a hollow house filled with lies. I couldn't pretend anymore. The clarity I felt that night carried me through what needed to happen next. My first step was gathering every shred of evidence I had. The motel receipts, the prenatal clinic slip with Ryan's name, even the pictures I'd taken of Isabel meeting him. My lawyer and I went through it all, building a case that would make the divorce as swift and clean as possible. The paternity test remained a sticking point. Isabel continued to refuse, claiming it was unnecessary, but I knew the truth. Her refusal only confirmed what I already suspected. The child wasn't mine. Meanwhile, Isabel oscillated between begging for forgiveness and lashing out in anger. Some nights she cried, insisting she wanted to make things work. Other times, she accused me of abandoning her, of being the reason she'd sought comfort elsewhere. I stopped engaging. Her words didn't carry the weight they once had. They were just noise now. One evening, Isabel came home and dropped a bombshell. She announced she was moving out. For weeks, she had insisted she wanted to stay, to fight for our marriage, but now, she had apparently changed her mind. Or maybe Ryan had helped her make it. Either way, I didn't argue. Her leaving would only make things easier. Over the next few days, she packed her things and moved into what I assumed was Ryan's house. The silence she left behind was a relief. I felt like I could finally breathe again. But the mess she'd created was far from over. A week later, I received a letter from Isabel's lawyer. She was filing for spousal support and claiming I was the father of her child. The audacity of it stunned me, but I knew I couldn't let it rattle me. My lawyer filed a counterclaim, requesting the paternity test and challenging her demand for support. The evidence we had was enough to cast doubt on her claims, but I knew this was going to be a fight. The day of the hearing arrived, and I sat in the courtroom, my hands gripping the edge of the table as Isabel walked in. She looked nervous, but she held her head high, as if she still believed she could win. Ryan wasn't with her, though I'd half expected him to be. The proceedings began, and my lawyer presented the evidence. The motel receipts, the prenatal clinic slip, the pictures. Each piece painted a clear picture of infidelity and deception. Isabel's lawyer tried to counter, insisting the receipts were circumstantial and that the clinic slip didn't prove anything. But then came the moment I'd been waiting for. The judge ordered the paternity test. The results came back 2 weeks later. As expected, the child wasn't mine. The confirmation felt both validating and heartbreaking. While I was relieved to be free from the financial burden of supporting a child that wasn't mine, the reality of what Isabel had done hit me all over again. She had dragged me into her lies, tried to pin the consequences on me, and showed no remorse. The judge ruled in my favor. The divorce was finalized, and Isabel's claims for spousal support were denied. I walked out of that courtroom, feeling lighter than I had in years. The chains she'd wrapped around me had finally been broken. The months that followed were a whirlwind of rebuilding. I threw myself into my work, focusing on my career and finding purpose again. The house that once felt like a prison became a sanctuary as I slowly reclaimed it, room by room. The memories of Isabel and her betrayal faded, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. One day, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Isabel's child, now a teenager. The words were polite but distant, asking for permission to change her last name to Ryan's. She wanted to be adopted by her mother's new husband. For a moment, I felt a pang of bitterness. I had supported this child financially for years, not out of love, but because the law had demanded it. But now, I realized I didn't need to hold on to that resentment. I wrote back, granting her request, and closed that chapter of my life for good. Years passed, and life moved on. I earned promotions, finished my degree, and eventually found someone who truly valued loyalty and honesty. Her name was Claire, and she came into my life when I least expected it. Claire had her own scars, her own story of betrayal, but together, we found healing. Our relationship was built on trust and respect, things I hadn't realized I'd been missing for so long. Looking back, I realized Isabel's betrayal, as painful as it had shaped me into a stronger person. It taught me the value of integrity, the importance of setting boundaries, and the strength it takes to walk away from something toxic. Years later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Isabel and Ryan didn't last. Their relationship, built on lies and betrayal, had crumbled under the weight of its own deception. Part of me felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt indifferent. Their lives were no longer my concern. Standing on my porch one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, I thought about everything that had happened. The pain, the anger, the loss, it had all led me here to a life I was proud of. I had rebuilt myself from the ashes of betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free. Ultimately, my journey reminds me that loyalty and integrity are priceless. Though it took nearly 2 decades, I found my happy ending and peace.